We are going to solve this GMAT question. This is an inference question and is a hard level question. First, we are going to read the passage, then the question stem, then we'll move on to the answer choices. Transportation expenses accounted for a large portion of the total dollar amount spent on trips for pleasure by residents of the US in 1997. This is a huge sentence. Let's break it down. So he's talking about transportation expenses and that it accounted for a large portion. So large can mean anything. It's not necessary that it's greater than 50% of the total dollar amount, obviously, because he'll be talking about that only. What else? Spent on trips for pleasure. So we have to keep this in mind. They might play around this by residents of the US in 1997. So basically, transportation expense, large amount, uh, trips for pleasure, 1997. Right. And about half of the total dollar amount spent on the transportation was airfare. All right. So basically, for in 1997, for the trips in trips for pleasure, the total dollar amount spent by residents of US, the large portion accounted for was transportation, and inside transportation, more than half or about half, sorry, not more than half, was airfare. All right. Okay. However, the large majority of United States residents who took trips for pleasure in 1997 did not travel by airplane but used other means of transportation. However, is a transition word. So he's saying that large majority of the US residents did not take trips via airplane. Yet, yet 25 or about half of the total dollar amount spent on transportation was airfare. So it could be the scenario that a very few people who are taking the airfare or are traveling by aeroplanes are contributing to most of the dollar amount for transportation or about half of the dollar amount for transportation, right? That could be a scenario. It's not necessary for a large majority of US residents to take the trip by airplane also, right? So with that understanding, let's move ahead. If the statements above are true, which of the following must also be true about US residents who took trips for pleasure in 1997? All right. He's talking about US residents who took trips for pleasure. So he's talking about this cross segment of the whole of the all the people. So he's saying most of those who traveled by airplane did so because the airfare to their destination was lower than the cost of other available means of transportation. We have no idea of knowing why they traveled via airplane, whether cost was a concern. Maybe it was the situation that these were old people and they were not very comfortable moving around in airplanes. It could be anything. Maybe they had they wanted to go from point A to point B and they were uh, not allowed to use the airplanes because of some medical reasons, right? Maybe it could be their personal preference or anything. So we can't know why they did so. So we have no way of knowing that. Reject. Most of those who traveled by airplane did so because other means of transportation to their destinations were unavailable. The same reasoning applies here as well. We don't know whether this was the situation or cost was the situation or it was a personal preference. We cannot answer that based on above. Per mile traveled, those who traveled by airplane tended to spend more on transportation to their destination than did those who used other means of transportation. So we know that people who are traveling by airplane are contributing to, in the transportation costs, around half of the cost are being contributed to by people who are traveling by airplane. No, not half, majority. No, about half. Right? So firstly, he is talking about per mile traveled. So he is wanting to us to calculate total cost for this certain cross section of people upon total miles, and he's wanting us to compare that with total cost of this cross section of people upon total miles. Now we don't know the number of miles that are traveled by people who are using other means of transportation versus the number of miles traveled by the people who are using airplanes, right? So we can't comment on this. We have no info about number of miles. Overall, people who did not travel by airplane had lower average transportation expenses than people who did. We do know that the number of people who are using airplanes is a very small number. So, average transportation expenses, total expense upon total people. So, people who are not traveling by airplanes is a small number and their expenses is high. So, this number would be high. And the people who did not, there are lot, no, the number of people is more and their expenses is around the same, right? So obviously this will be lower. So this is wrong. This is opposite. We need an opposite answer. Let's hope if E is the opposite. Those who traveled by airplane spent about as much on average on other means of transportation as they did on airfare. Means of transportation. So he's trying to say that those who travel by airplane spent about as much on an average on other means of transportation as they did on airfare. So he's saying that the total amount spent on other means is same as the amount spent on airfare by the people who are traveling via airfare. Did not travel by airplane but used other means of transportation. So a large majority of residents are doing this. So let's say this is 60%. They did not travel by airplane at all, right? And the remaining amount, let's say the 40%, is traveling by planes. So it could be the situation that the transportation expenses, about the half of it is because of the 40% of the people who are using the airfare, right? All that makes sense. Now coming back to E, we have no way of knowing that. Now let me come back to D. Overall, people who did not travel by airplane had lower average transportation expenses than people who did. So people who did not travel by airplane, who did not, was a large majority of people. And about half of the total dollar amount spent on transportation was airfare. So the amount spent on transportation was almost same for airfare versus other means. But we know that the large majority of residents who took trips for pleasure in 97 did not travel. So obviously people who are using other means are on average spending less, at lower average transportation expenses than people who did. Right. So this is the answer. Right. Last time I thought it was the other way around, but this is our answer.